From Matthew 5, verses 31 through 32. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a written notice of divorce. But I tell you, everyone who divorces his wife, except in a case of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. I want to start off by acknowledging that this is kind of a hard one for us for three reasons. One, some of you may have parents or family members who are divorced, and unfortunately, this passage has often been used as a weapon to shame people. But I don't think that's how Jesus intended it. As a general rule, Jesus doesn't use shame as a teaching tool. That doesn't mean Jesus isn't serious about it, just that the church has often misused Jesus' words. Number two, marriage in the first century is just not the same thing as it is today. It's important to note some of those differences in order to listen to what Jesus would teach us. And one of those differences is kind of our third complication. None of you are married right now. None of you are really planning on getting married anytime soon. But that would not have been the case if you had lived in the first century with Jesus. Many of you would either be married or in a long-term engagement. We think of marriage as primarily a relationship agreement between two adults who, because they love each other, decide on their own that they want to spend the rest of their lives together. But in the first century, a young woman was often given in marriage before she was even fully a woman. Even before she would be able to have babies, her father would make a legal agreement with a man who was probably already in his 20s. It would be an agreement between her father and this man, and she may not even be asked her opinion. In the first century, children were property of their parents, specifically their father. Also, they're a culture based on farming, and families could only eat what they could grow. A male child would learn from a young age to work in the field and would be able to help his family produce more. He might even get an education or learn a trade. Thus, a male child could begin providing for his family at a very young age. Unfortunately, female children were not allowed to work in the fields, and they were never sent to school so they could not provide for themselves or their families, and they became very expensive for their fathers. A woman in the first century cannot support herself. She must rely on her father, a fiancé, or a husband to provide for her most basic needs. When a father secured a husband for his daughter, he was no longer financially responsible for her, and he could more easily feed the rest of his family. So, a young woman would be engaged to a man at a young age. She would continue living with her family until she became old enough to be married, perhaps several years. While she was engaged and living with her family, her husband-to-be became her male provider. She would then rely on him to provide for her for the rest of her life. So in first century Judaism, based on the law, a man could divorce his wife by just filling out a piece of paper. When a man divorced a woman, she gets nothing, and she would have no one to provide for her. She would starve. She would go from having a house and family and food and a husband to basically being homeless and penniless just because her husband filled out a piece of paper. A divorced woman would have to remarry as soon as possible because without a husband, she would starve. This is what Jesus means when he says, a husband who divorces his wife forces her to commit adultery. A divorced woman must find another man, a husband, to sleep with, just so she can eat. I don't think the principle of this story is that modern-day divorced people have forced one another into sinning. I think Jesus is saying you shouldn't throw people away. You shouldn't be able to make someone go hungry because you're just done with them. Earlier in his message, Jesus said his followers should be like a lamp lighting up an entire house. We should shine light into the world. You don't have to be married to hear Jesus' message. You as a teenager in 2021 can hear and apply this message. I think first century marriage is just a real world example of what Jesus is trying to teach us. Your presence should light other people's worlds. Christians aren't people who throw other people away. We are people who keep our commitments. When you commit to someone, you keep your words so that you don't put them in a situation where they become desperate. Christians keep their word because they know it affects others. You are a light in a dark room. We light up their worlds. We don't throw people away. This week, I want you to ask, how can I experiment with keeping my word? Or maybe you want to see this teaching from the perspective of the first century woman who's been discarded. How can you look for people who have been discarded by others? How can you be a light to them?